Hello, everyone. On this video, we are going to deal with the research hypothesis. We'll differentiate the different types and categories of hypothesis and how we are going to use the hypothesis on our research. We are going to list down some criterias on what is a good hypothesis start. So let's look into what's a research hypothesis. Now let's look onto the definitions of hypothesis. Different people, different authors, and different websites in the internet gives us different definitions of hypothesis. So here are some. The first one, it is an alternative answer to a question about variables, their relationships, and the other facts involved in the research. Another definition of hypothesis is that it must be tested through analytical investigation to prove how true or not the problem is. A hypothesis is very crucial in our research because this is the one that gives us a way on how we are going to deal with the experiments or conduction of our own research to come up with the result that we wanted to have. We tend to come up with these tentative answers to our problem so that we are guided on what to look into on our research. Let's look into the importance of the hypothesis in our research. Number one is that hypothesis enables the researcher to objectively investigate new areas of discovery. Thus, it provides a powerful tool for the advancement of knowledge. The second importance of hypothesis in research is that it provides objectivity to the research activities. And the third one is that it provides directions to conduct the research. It is clear here that the hypothesis provides a specific and clear goals to our researchers. In this way, the researchers has a basis for selecting sample and research procedures to meet the goals. Another importance of hypothesis is that it suggests which type of research design is likely to be most appropriate. If we know our tentative answer, if we know our goal, if we know the path that we are taking, then it's likely to have to use the most appropriate research design based on the hypothesis that we have. The hypothesis also stimulates the thinking process of us researchers because we wanted to look forward on what will be the result of our research. And it served as a framework of drawing conclusion. Since it's a tentative statement, it guides us, the researchers, towards the direction in which the research should proceed, which is to coming up with a better result on our experiment. A question in our mind will keep track on what makes a good hypothesis. On this diagram coming from verywellmind.com, it's give us a 4 steps on how we make a good hypothesis. Number 1 is that we need to have a solid question. We need to have the question that we will answer, the problem that we are going to solve. The second one is that we need to have a good background of the research that we are going to have. We need to come up with this better solution. Therefore, we are going to look into some ways on how are we going to do our research. The third one is that we make sure that our hypothesis is testable. We make sure that all of our variables can be tested, can be manipulated, and that let's make sure that our hypothesis contains the independent and the dependent variables. Let's take note that this hypothesis is only applicable to quantitative type of research. Hypothesis, on the other hand, should consist of clearly defined and understandable concepts. Hypothesis can be stated in declarative statement and in present tense, in which way we are able to clearly understand what our hypothesis is. Next is that hypothesis must be objective, specific, and can explain the relations or the relationships between variables. In this, we are sure that our hypothesis is the good hypothesis for our research. And lastly, we should take note that to make our hypothesis the good hypothesis is that it should be anchored. It should be aligned to our research problem. Hindi naman kasi pa pwede na ang gusto mong malaman ay ang epekto ng ilaw sa paglago ng halaman at ang hypothesis mo naman ay kung malakas ang music ay lalago ang halaman. Masyadong malayo, di ba? So we need to take note that the hypothesis should be always aligned, anchored to our research problem. Let's move on to the purpose. Para saan ba ang ginagamit natin na ito? Para saan ang hypothesis? So the purpose of hypothesis, number one, is that it guides us on which aspect of the research to focus on. Saan ba tayo magbibigay ng pagtuon, mas malalim na pagpansin sa ating research. Number two, we provide opportunities to prove the relationship between variables. Isang purpose ng hypothesis ay para malaman ano ba talaga ang kinalaman ng isang variable sa isa pang variable. Dito matutukoy natin kung ang hypothesis ba natin ay tama o mali. Number three, it gives us the right direction of our research. Hindi yung kung saan-saan tayo pupunta, kung ano-ano ang ating tutuklasin. If we have the hypothesis, we are going to look into on one certain path, and that's how we will do the research. That's how we are going to do the experiment. That's how we are going to draw the conclusion. Next, number four is that we push for an empirical study to prove the existence of the relationship. So we are going to go deeper para mapatunayan natin na merong relasyon ang lahat ng variables na ating tinukoy bago pa mag-umpisa ang ating research. Let's move on to the categories of the hypothesis. There are two categories of a hypothesis. We have null and we have alternative hypothesis. In the null hypothesis, it's denoted or symbolized with capital H and small letter O or HO. The null hypothesis states the absence of relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. Later, we are going to come up with a little examples for this hypothesis. On the other hand, another category of hypothesis, we have alternative hypothesis, which will be denoted with HI, or some books will have it HA. But in this lesson, we are going to use HI. The alternative hypothesis states the relationship between the independent and the dependent variable. Halimbawa, we want to look into the effects of the different colors of light to the growth of a mongo plant. We can state that the hypothesis in the null form or in the null hypothesis there's no significant effect on the growth of the mongo plant by the use of different colors of light. Again, the different colors of light has no direct effect on the growth of the mongo plant. That's a null hypothesis. It states the absence of the relationship, no significant effect. The alternative one, we can state that light has an effect, or the different colors of light has an effect to the growth of a mango plant. So that's an alternative hypothesis. These categories have many types as well. The first type of a hypothesis is we have a theory-driven hypothesis where it is based on existing theories, scientific laws, other subject areas, social sciences, theories placed there. We will anchor our hypothesis on those concepts. The next type of hypothesis is the data-driven, where it is based on the findings of previous research studies. So we anchor our hypothesis, we based our hypothesis on previous results. The descriptive type of hypothesis is it specify the relationship between two variables due to the influence of something. Another type of hypothesis is the directional or the one-tailed hypothesis. Here, it states the relationship of two variables as well as the direction of those. The first example that I gave is a null hypothesis of a directional hypothesis. Ibig sabihin, we are able to state our hypothesis in one directional. There is no significant effect on the growth of the plant. Here, in this example, there is a positive relationship between the years of teaching experience and job satisfaction among teachers. There is one direction that is going to, that the independent variable has an effect to the dependent variable. Let's take note that to express direction or relationship between variables, we need to use directional terms such as positive, negative, less, more, increase, decrease, higher, lower, or etc. Just like what we have given in the null hypothesis, it's a directional hypothesis where we stated there are no significant effect. It's a directional since we stated the no word as part of the relationship. The non-directional hypothesis, on the other hand, as type of a hypothesis, states the relationship but not the direction of the relationship. If you're going to look into this example, there is relationship between the years of teaching experience and job satisfaction among teachers. There is a relationship, but we don't know whether it is positive or negative. Whether the relationship increases, decreases as the years of experience pass by. So there's a non-directional hypothesis. The last type of hypothesis is that the causal hypothesis. It is used due to cause-effect relationship. So here, we are going to use the if and then statement. Example, if dogs are fed treats, then they will bark less. So the cause is the feeding treats to the dog, while the effect is that the dog barks less. So the causal relationship here, or the causal hypothesis here, gives us what is the cause and what is the effect. Now, how to formulate a hypothesis? Let's look into on this. Number one is that we need to express the hypothesis in a declarative form and not in an interrogative, not in a question form. Let's always think of the hypothesis as the answer to the question. That's why it is always to be in a declarative form. The next step is that support your hypothesis by facts or theories. This is much needed so that your hypothesis is a good hypothesis. And then we establish logical relationship between the hypothesis and the research problem or the RP. Let us take note that our hypothesis should always be anchored to our research problem. What the research problem is should be given a tentative answer, which is the hypothesis. Then the fourth one is that have it predict the nature of relationship between and among variables. Whether it is positive or negative, there is relationship or not, then we need to predict the nature of the relationship. And the last one is that we use clear, exact, or specific language when we formulate hypotheses. Before we end our discussion, let us have different examples of hypothesis. And let's go back to a different definitions of hypothesis through a video clip.
The hypothesis represents the researcher's expectations about the relationship between the variables of the problem. A research investigation begins with a question, but questions cannot be tested directly. It is the proposed relationship between the variables that
Let
is
us take
tested.
note that the hypothesis
The
is a
hypothesis
tentative
represents
answer.
an educated guess about what will happen in an experiment. A research hypothesis is a testable statement derived from the research question. The null hypothesis states that there is no relationship between the two variables being studied. In other words, one variable does not affect the other. It is a negation of what the experimenter actually expects or predicts. A null hypothesis is used because it enables researchers to compare their findings with chance expectations through statistical tests. It states that the results are due to chance and are not significant in terms of supporting the idea being investigated. The alternative hypothesis states that there is a relationship between the two variables being studied. In other words, one variable has an effect on the other. It states that the results are not due to chance and that they are significant in terms of supporting the theory being investigated. Hypotheses may be either directional or non-directional. A directional hypothesis specifies the nature of the relationship or difference that is being predicted, such as that a specific group or condition will be higher or lower or have more or less of something, or it predicts the specific direction that a correlation will take. A non-directional hypothesis, on the other hand, states that a relationship or difference exists, but without specifying the nature of the expected finding. An example of a directional hypothesis would be deaf children whose parents are deaf will acquire language faster than deaf children whose parents are not deaf. This specifies the direction of the condition. One group is faster than the other. An example of a non-directional hypothesis would be male and female supervisors will differ significantly in their use of threats as a compliance-gaining strategy. This indicates only that there is a difference between the groups. Let's look at some examples of the progression of the formulation of a hypothesis. Suppose our research question is, do students work better on Monday morning than they do on a Friday afternoon? We decide to study this by giving the same group of students a lesson on a Monday morning and on a Friday afternoon. We then measure their immediate recall on the material covered in each session. So our hypothesis could be, students will recall significantly more information on a Monday morning than on a Friday afternoon. For the research question, does eating breakfast affect student performance? A hypothesis could be, students who eat breakfast will perform better on a math exam than students who do not eat breakfast. For the research question, does using a cell phone while driving affect driver performance? A hypothesis could be, motorists who talk on the phone while driving will be more likely to make errors on a driving course than those who do not talk on the phone. It is not possible to test a hypothesis directly. Instead, you must turn the hypothesis into a null hypothesis, as described previously. The null hypothesis can be created from the hypothesis by adding the words no or not to the statement. The null hypothesis is, therefore, the opposite of the experimental hypothesis in that it states that there will be no change in the variable under study. An analogy for this is the criminal trial. Imagine you are the prosecutor. You believe and want to show evidence that the defendant is guilty. That is your alternative hypothesis. But you must assume that the defendant is innocent until proven guilty. So the null hypothesis is that the defendant is not guilty. Let's look at some examples for creating the null hypothesis. From our previous example, where our research question was, do students work better on Monday morning than they do on a Friday afternoon? We developed the alternative hypothesis. Students will recall significantly more information on a Monday morning than on a Friday afternoon. So in this case, our null hypothesis would be, there will be no significant difference in the amount of information recalled on a Monday morning as compared to a Friday afternoon. The null hypothesis assumes that any difference in the sample will be due to chance or confounding factors. In our second example, our research question was, does eating breakfast affect student performance? And our hypothesis was, students who eat breakfast will perform better on a math exam than students who do not eat breakfast. Therefore, the null hypothesis would be, there will be no significant difference in the performance of students who eat breakfast as compared to students who do not eat breakfast. Finally, in our third example, the research question was, does using a cell phone while driving affect driver performance? And our hypothesis was, motorists who talk on the phone while driving will be more likely to make errors on a driving course than those who do not talk on the phone. And so, our null hypothesis would be, there will be no significant difference in the number of errors on a driving course for individuals talking on a phone as compared to individuals not talking on a phone. All statistical testing is done on the null hypothesis, never the hypothesis. The result of a statistical test will enable you to either reject the null hypothesis or fail to reject the null hypothesis. We never use the words accept the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is supported if the results are statistically non-significant. The null hypothesis is never proven, at least not by a single study. There is an impossibility of proving a negative. The null hypothesis is rejected in favor of the experimental or alternative hypothesis if the results are statistically significant. In the next steps of the research process, you will proceed to testing the hypothesis. You will consider how to collect the data on the variables you have defined in your research question and your hypothesis about their relationship. Essentially, for this stage, you will be completing the sentence, a way I can test this hypothesis is. After collecting the data, you will analyze it to determine whether or not evidence supports your hypothesis. In this step, you will complete the sentence, I'll know my hypothesis is supported if. In this way, Each of the subsequent steps develops logically from the formulation of a clear and testable hypothesis. I hope this presentation has provided some helpful information and clarified the process of formulating a hypothesis.
Okay, so that's how are the different types of hypothesis, their categories, and how we are able to write the hypothesis and how to make a good hypothesis. So let's move on to our activity. So here, you need to write a hypothesis based on the given questions. But let us take note that our hypothesis should be anchored to the research problem that we are going to have. So what we are going to do on this activity is that you need to write your hypothesis based on these questions. Number one, what effect does high temperature have on radish germination? Number two, what effect does studying with music have on students' test scores? Number three, what effect does food color have on the amount of food fish eat? Number four, what effect does light have on the growth of a plant? And number five, what effect does smiling have on teacher giving no homework? So here, you're going to write again a hypothesis based on these given questions. I hope that you have learned something from these discussions. See you again on our next video lessons. Again, this is the research hypothesis.